Thank you again for listening to The History of the Papacy. I'm your host, Steve, and we are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network. There are many great shows on the network, so I would definitely suggest you go over to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. I'd like to mention, as I want to do, that we are on Patreon at patreon.com/history of the papacy. You know the deal. There's 4 tiers: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome, which each represent one of the 4 traditional patriarchates of early Christianity. There are many great benefits to joining on Patreon. You get bonus audio, video content, monthly book drawings, early content, advertisement-free content, and you're really going a long way to helping keep this project sustainable. So I really appreciate you considering joining on patreon.com/history of the papacy. Now let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have Roberto, Joran, William, Brian, Jeffrey, Christina, John, and Sarah at the Alexandria level, Dapo, Paul, Justin, Lana, and John, all of whom are magnificent, at Constantinople, and reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome, we have Peter the Great. Today we continue our journey through Celtic Christianity with Dr. Carolyn McNamara of the University of Scotland. This time we're going to continue talking about Dr. McNamara's personal study of archaeology on the Isle of Lismore in Scotland. We get into some of the more problematic and fun aspects of archaeology. Hint, Indiana Jones is problematic. With that, here is the next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. That's really interesting because it adds something, like you said, that there was a possibility of something being a Bronze Age. And that's something, who would write about that? If you're just setting up a monastery there and there's a house that was maybe there and it was super old, or maybe it wasn't, they wouldn't maybe even known it was there. It had already been buried. So that's something that would just never come across in a text.
Right. And even, there are bruchs and dunes that exist on the island that likely would have had people living in them at the time that MacLeod would have come over. And, that's not mentioned in the text at all. We don't technically even get a mention of the founding of the church. We just have to presume it happened before MacLeod died in 592.
And so what did some of these items help you and help the others experts learn a little bit more about this site?
Yeah, so the structures can help us understand a site because we know that there are typical kinds of houses or structures that are built. If we are looking at the vallum around a church, it's not quite a wall, it's usually a ditch, but it kind of delineates the monastery or the church's space from the general secular space. And based on the shape of the vallum can give us a little bit of information about maybe who built that church or who built that original structure. The designs or even the type of pottery, like its shape or its composition, can tell us if they were trading with someone and this pottery has come from somewhere else. We know that there were Roman amphorae and such that were being traded into the north of Britain during Roman times. And so we can find out more about, who is trading with who or who's making what. We can find information from the animal bones. Do they show signs of being butchered? So are these animals that were being eaten? Or is it more likely that this was just somebody's old horse who, died out in the field and they maybe just kind of covered it up and buried it? So there's a lot of information. And even, say, in the shroud pen, the decoration that exists on that shroud pen, we can compare with other shroud pens that have been found elsewhere and kind of see where that fits in, and that can help us understand more about the site and its people.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the human graves and some of the human remains that were found?
Right. So, as I said, they had their human remains specialist, and so she was able to know much more than I would ever know. I'm not sure I would even really recognize a human bone from an animal bone if you put them in front of me and didn't tell me there was one of each. So she said that they did find, as expected, adults being buried. They did find some juveniles or younger people, and then also some infants. And some were in, what we might consider a proper grave. Like this was their original burial place. They were intended to be put in like this, in this place. And some that were what's referred to as disturbed. So they were probably moved from somewhere else, or some other method of having disturbed those remains. But as far as close details on that, I wait anxiously for the final dig report, which I'm really looking forward to reading.
When they unearth human remains, what did they do with them afterwards?
A lot of that depends on, I think, the community that it's found in, the place it's found in, and the culture surrounding that, and the connection that those people might have to the living communities. So in North America, the US specifically, there is a law. It's called NAGPRA, which is the North American Graves Repatriation Act. And because the indigenous peoples and the various cultures that exist in North America still have very close cultural, religious, and familial ties to these early people, today, now, it wasn't always this way. There's a requirement that those remains be returned to those cultures so that way they can be appropriately reinterred. Previous to the existence of laws like that, most bones would just be put into a collection and put into storage in a museum. So you'll see sometimes in the news stories of the reinterring of remains that were gathered for archaeological purposes, and other times those remains do go into museums.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I was just talking to somebody else about Billy the Kid's bones, and this is kind of completely unrelated, but people wanted to disinter him and his mom and like 3 other people to try and prove some point of who, if somebody else was an imposter or actually Billy the Kid. And I was thinking to myself, that seems like a lot of disruption of burial goods, or, buried people just for a curiosity. And it seems like that could be a very fine line in archaeology of, yeah, you really want to find something, but these are real people too.
Yeah, and there's definitely a level of respect that's shown to any human remains that are found, no matter how old they are. There's always this recognition, like these are actual people that lived, whether it's a baby that didn't live that long or whether it's a 80-year-old person that, you found their remains in the ground. So archaeologists always want to treat them with respect and be sensitive to the fact that these were real living people that existed.
Now, what was it like to be on an actual archaeological dig? Because it's kind of something like half between a construction site and a scientific laboratory. What was it like actually being on this dig?
Yeah, it was lots of fun. It was lots of hard work. We spent every day that I was there for 6 days. So we spent every day on site from about 9 a.m. to about 4:30 p.m. with breaks for tea and lunch. And so most of that time is spent in the trench, kneeling on hands and knees with your trowel, kind of scraping away at the ground in these small sections. So it's lots of hard work. My hands were really sore for a good 4 days afterwards. I'd never had my hands that sore before.
Do they usually have experts like you and cross-disciplinarian experts on a dig? Or is that something that gets sorted out later?
So I think it's useful to talk about different kinds of digs that can exist. So you'll have digs that are completely professionally run and manned. So they'll all be professional archaeologists or specialists that are all working on the dig. The dig that we did was run a lot through community volunteering. So with the exception of just a few people on the site, the rest of us were volunteers. So you didn't have to have any specialty or knowledge. We had a couple people who came who had never been in a trench before, had never been on an archaeological site, didn't know anything about, medieval history or medieval Lismore, and just were curious and interested and came to volunteer. And they were as welcome as anybody else. And then you'll have events that are community archaeology days that are more intended to show people, archaeology in their community, rather than we really think we're going to find something today. They may dig a slew of test pits and, give people the tools and say, go at it, have fun. And they're less concerned about the meticulousness than they are about the exposure of people to archaeology. And then you'll also have field schools, which are usually university run with professors and students, and the students are learning the very meticulous process of digging, of drawing up your trench and all of that.
Practically speaking, like when you were in that trench for that time period, like on your typical day when you're scraping, how often were you coming across like something?
So I think that it can vary. I worked in 2 different trenches for the time that I was there. And in the first trench, it was really boggy ground. So it was really wet. And that was when I spent most of my time trying to dig out this wall that I found. So the wall being a pretty large thing, most of what I dealt with was just that. I think I found a couple pieces of bone. I probably put more than a few just rocks in the pan for the finds, just because I thought they looked interesting, and let's be on the safe side, and I'll just put this interesting looking thing in there. And if it's just a rock, they can check it out later. But in the second trench that I was in, there was a lot of charcoal and fragments of almost fully decomposed bone. So it was so delicate, and it was likely just animal bone, but it was so delicate that there's no way that it would have been possible to save it. So we're just at that point going, make a note that there was evidence of bones here, but it was nothing that you could try to save, and that there was evidence of charcoal, but really there was very little that you could try to save. I saw a picture recently from another dig that's happening in Scotland right now, where they found a round barrow. And as they pulled the layers away, they're able to see this shadow of a human skeleton, because the bones have degraded so much that there's nothing left that you can try to save. You can't dig anything out, but you can still see in this shadow exactly where the body was laid out. Like you can see its head and its feet and its hands and, its leg bones. Like you can see all that, but it's almost this, it does exist, but it doesn't exist at the same time.
And now a word from our sponsors. What's the level of supervision? Like, do you hit, or do somebody like a volunteer, you hit something and then the pro comes in and, all right, you can keep doing this? Or, because I would imagine you get in a lot of volunteers, you might get somebody who's really zealous and just is like, dig, 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 where you have somebody else who wants to point out every single, they find a little scrap of dirt and they want to tell.
Yeah, there's definitely some good oversight, which I really appreciated. I have only volunteered on one other dig before, so I consider myself fairly untested in the field, as it were. And yeah, it was really great to have some oversight. And if I was doing something wrong, to be told, you're taking too much dirt at a time, take less, or, don't stand on the part of the dirt that you just scraped clean, because you might mess something up, or don't stand in somebody else's part that they've just scraped clean. You learn all of those kind of methodical practices as you go along. But yeah, if I found something that I was like, this looks like it could possibly be something, and they had a few, very, very experienced people digging in each trench. And so we'd be able to go, hey, can you come have a look at this and tell me if it's anything or if it's just a cool looking rock.
Now, archaeology as a science has changed tremendously over the decades and even the centuries. How is archaeology done today differently than it was practiced in earlier times? I mean, you think of the archetypal old school archaeologist of Indiana Jones. Clearly, things have changed from Indiana Jones times. What are some of the big things that have changed?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I loved Indiana Jones as a child, but now knowing what I know about archaeology, I really shudder to think of, anybody who might behave in an archaeological site like him. So in the earliest days, I think it was a little bit more Indiana Jones-ish, maybe less with, people's faces getting melted off, or, traps with giant stones that are going to roll down and crush you. Maybe less that, but more of what felt more like relic hunting than they were making methodical analyses of the entire approach. So you have sometimes people who are, and I'll go so far as to say it, some people who really just were grave robbers. They just had lots of money and could afford to put them in collections instead of trying to sell them on the market. But really, early times, there were some people that behaved more that way. It's fortunately changed a lot, but there could be a whole separate conversation about the ethics of many items in many museums around the world. And it was a male-dominated field originally, like so much of academia was. So there were a lot of assumptions that were made about early societies or the people that were found in the digs that maybe we wouldn't make today, or we wouldn't have those same assumptions. So some big examples for that would be heteronormativity, or gender roles or gender associations for skeletons that were found. They used to just go, oh, there's a sword in here, this must be a man, and look no further.
It's interesting too, because there's got to be, in different contexts, there's must be some incentive to get the big find that will change the way everybody views history, because then you can write papers on that and get into journals. And is there sort of checks and balances in place? Because I was just reading a book, and I just happened to watch a discussion about another academic who had really put out a certain find, that this particular find wound up being a forgery, and a lot of the checks had failed. What do they kind of do to stop somebody from saying, oh, I found this sword and it's King Arthur's sword?
Yeah, the biggest kind of check and balance that we have as academics is mostly each other. So if we want to publish something, whether it's in a journal or if it's in an academic book, there's a peer review process that all goes through. So your manuscript will get sent off to a reviewer, hopefully someone who has enough expertise in that area of the field to be able to say, hey, this doesn't seem right to me. And, you'll go through usually multiple rounds of peer review. And so that's the opportunity for your reviewer to say, hey, I don't think your methodology quite works out here, or I think you're making a big assumption leap over here. Have a think about that, or can you more clearly show how you get from A to B? So that's really the big thing that I know of as an academic. I think that it really is just this peer interaction that's gonna evaluate what you put out. And maybe if you get a reputation for putting out poor work, or it's making huge leaps of faith that don't have sufficient evidence, then that's going to affect your academic reputation, which could affect what journals you get to publish in, or what universities who are interested in having you work there.
Now, what you've described so far is a pretty manual process. There's a lot of shovels and trowels and long times digging with, just scraping away centimeters or even millimeters of dirt. What has technology done to help this process along?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. So there is a lot of technological innovation that has changed. So in the early days, there wasn't a lot of attention to the soil itself, because we didn't have a means of getting at those really tiny pieces of evidence. But today we can find plant spores in the dirt to find out what kind of environment existed at the time. Was it a forest? Was it a field? What kind of foods are showing up at that small level? Are there seeds that we're finding in the dirt? They've got ground penetrating radar, which helps us get a glimpse under the ground without having to dig into it. Now, it's not perfect, but it does give much greater glimpse than staring at the grass and going, I don't know, there's stuff under there for sure.
Something.
They can do 3D scans of finds these days, which is extremely helpful, especially if you're trying to see, say, faded or damaged carvings on a stone. I would love to get 3D image scans of various carved crosses that I've looked at. That would be really helpful. We've got dendrochronology available to us these days, and that's dating wood by the tree rings that exist in that wood, and you can date it to the year that it was cut down. And the way that works is they build up a chronology of trees by starting, in the present, and then you match up the rings on the trees, because trees make rings every year, and depending on whether it was a good year for the tree or a bad year for the tree, the rings will be thicker or thinner. So they can match those up and go backwards in time and build this chronology through the rings of trees. So that way, if you find a log that was part of a house that was constructed in your site and you've got a chronology for that area, you can kind of pinpoint this is when this tree was cut down, which I think is amazing. We use MRIs and CT scans. Archaeologists can access them to do scans on objects and can get additional information about what's inside it without having to unseal or open or even damage it, because sometimes there are, say, pots that are found and they're fully enclosed and there's cloth wrapped around them. And if the cloth is badly deteriorated, trying to take it off that pot to get a look at what's inside likely is just going to destroy it. So you can do an X-ray or a CT scan or an MRI of it and try to get some more information about what seems to be inside it before you make that decision on whether or not to try to open it, because that may be, and that's an irrevocable damage that you're going to cause to that item. And then I think the last thing that I can think of is spectrophotometry, which is this, it's beyond my real understanding of how it works, but I know that it uses light to determine the composition of things. And so that's things like pigments, glass, painted objects, textiles, printed materials. So you can find out exactly what its composition is. And that gives you more information about maybe, if it's a pigment, where did that pigment come from based on that composition? Or for glass, you can start to make associations that you couldn't have made just trying to look at it with the naked eye.
And now a word from our sponsors. What's kind of the process? They step out into the field and there's something there. They know they want to dig this area. What's kind of the process that they decide on where to go and how to start?
Yeah, that is a process don't have much personal experience with, but my understanding is, they find a site that they think might have something of interest. And so the dig that they did on Lismore was the third year that they had dug at Lismore. So they had known some from previous digs that this was an area they were interested in, but they also had previously done some of that ground penetrating radar. And so they can look and say, okay, it looks likely that there really is something under here. And they may get to that point where they decide to do the ground penetrating radar through walking through the field itself and going, okay, so the way that the ground lays here looks like, maybe there's evidence of a mound or a structure that's under here. And that can help you to say, yes, it's likely there's something here. If there's textual evidence that says that this should be the area where something is, that can help you make that decision. So I think there's a lot that can go into it. And these days, especially with the rise of drones, there's a lot more aerial footage that is available. And so when you get kind of high up and altitude and look down on a site, especially if it's been, say, an especially dry summer, you'll start to see features being picked up by these aerial photographs, because there's a difference in the ground itself, whether it's more compressed or less compressed, that affects how the plants will grow. And so you'll frequently see a lot of, say, dying off grass, but there might be this bit of greener area that's in the shape of what looks like a structure. And so they can can use that now to help find some sites. And there are some sites that have been found through this aerial photography.
I mean, that's fascinating. That's the technology helps so much, but it probably can also lead to analysis paralysis, where you have so many different places you want to dig, only so much time, so many people, so much resources to devote, that it might get to be difficult that where to actually begin.
Yeah, and that's a great point, that you have to, decide what are you going to shoot for, because you have to get funding for these digs. Very few people, I think, are wealthy enough to fund these out of their own pockets. So you have to convince your funding body that this site is important enough to get some money for it. You have to get the permission of the landowner. So who owns that land? Are they going to give you permission to dig on it? There's, questions of, all right, so we've gone and looked at it, and what do we think is the likelihood that there's something here? Is it high? Is it low? So that can help make some of those decisions. And you also want to think about, we don't want to dig up everything today that exists, because just think about how far our technology has come in the last 20 years, the last 50 years, and how far our technology will go in the next 20 years, in the next 50 years, in the next 100 years. If we dig up everything today, then we won't leave anything for that advanced technology in the future. And that we don't need morally or ethically to dig up absolutely everything. We're trying to understand the past, but in a respectful way that doesn't say, let's just dig up the first meter of ground across the entire globe as we can and just get everything like that. I don't think that would be a good idea.
Discussing this episode, it's more than just being on one of these archaeological digs, is more than just basically working on your hands and knees and scraping the ground. There's a lot of other activities for the volunteers after hours. It almost sounds like a carnival type event. What were some of the other activities that were afterwards that made it sounds like a really fun experience?
Yeah, so I think especially for community archaeology, but even for, professional archaeologists, they tend to have some engagement with the community, because you want a connection between the dig and the community that it's happening in, because this is generally their history that you're digging up. So I know for this dig that I was involved in on Lismore, they had a community open day where the whole point was for the whole day for members of the community or just curious people from nearby to come in and see what's going on and learn a little bit. And even on, regular dig days when it wasn't a community day, if someone wandered by and looked over the fence, it was like, hey, what are y'all doing? Somebody would stand up and go over and have a chat with them and, tell them about what we're up to, because the whole point of this is to learn about the past and then to share it. We don't want to just go stick it in a library somewhere where nobody can ever read it. We want everybody to know. So there's that. I know there were a few public talks. I was very fortunate while I was there that I got to give a public talk, because I did a chapter of my PhD thesis on this early church at Lismore. So I was very well suited to help give some of that information back to the community. And I felt very honored to be able to do so. And then I know they had a concert where some local musicians came and played in the church, and that was open for volunteers in the community to all get to experience. And then they also had, I know, a talk by a historical fiction author who was talking about, her process of bringing history into her fiction writing.
Yeah, I think that has to be so much fun to be able to provide the community with the information, and then you get to hear what are some of maybe the folk tales or the reminiscences that people have about this site in their own community.
Yeah, and I think that that's something that especially academics understand a lot better now than they did really even 20 years ago, that community engagement, community outreach, what's called knowledge transfer is kind of the most official terminology you can get for it, is that, connecting to the community, and that our knowledge isn't necessarily just for the sake of learning something, although I do think that learning for learning's sake is a valuable thing. But what makes it exponentially more valuable is when you then share that knowledge with others, and especially with the members of the community whose history it is.
Well, I want to thank you so much for coming on to talk about this this particular experience that you had, because I think it really gives us so much more information about the things that we've talked about already in this series and the things that we are going to talk about.
Yeah, I'm really glad that I was able to share my experience with you. And I'll put in one final thing. And for people who are interested in archaeology, there's the question, can anyone get involved in archaeology? And the answer is absolutely yes. There's community archaeology events that happen all over the place, whether you're in the UK, whether you're in Ireland or Europe, elsewhere, or in Canada or the United States, Mexico. There's community archaeology events all over the place. You can look online for your local archaeology society, or even contact your local university's archaeology department. Most universities are going to have an archaeologist on staff at the very least. And so you could contact them. If you're in the US, there's the Archaeological Institute of America, and they talk about community archaeology or just events happening in your area talking about archaeology. So don't ever think that you don't live anywhere with access to it, because it's around, and it's archaeologists want to connect with the public and want to help people understand what it is they do.
Well, thank you again. And I want to thank everybody for listening, and definitely keep your podcatchers updated as Dr. McNamara takes us through more of this really fascinating and exciting history.